In today's podcast, we're going to be looking at questions again. How many of you know that the Apostle Paul is notorious for asking questions? And we call these rhetorical questions. They're not questions to really get an answer. They're questions to get you to think. Now, sometimes the Apostle Paul answers the questions. Sometimes he does not. But what he's trying to do is he's trying to get people to think, trying to get them to reason something out in their minds. And that's the whole purpose behind asking these rhetorical questions. So as we start in verse number 13 today, again, we're in the 11th chapter of 1 Corinthians, verse number 13, the Apostle Paul comes right out and says this: judge for yourself. In other words, examine this, get an opinion on this, think about this. You know, so much of modern day Christianity is done without thinking. You know, they hear some guy on a podcast, and I'm not against podcasts. In case you haven't noticed, I do podcasts. But I'm not here to give you all the answers. I'm here to give you a foundation so that you can think for yourself. And so the Apostle Paul starts right out in verse number 13 and says, judge for yourself, think for yourself, examine for yourself. And then he goes on and he asks this question: is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? What's he saying? Is it proper for a woman to talk to God with her head uncovered? Now think about that. I think, if I can answer this question, it's proper for a woman to talk to God at any time. But God's way is for her to be under the authority of her husband or her father. Do you understand that? Is it proper? Now, when he talks about proper, he talks about something that will help her to excel. This word proper, it's the Greek word prepo, prepo, and it means to excel or to make something distinguished. Does it make a woman distinguished to pray to God with her head uncovered? Well, how many of you know that a woman can pray to God at any time she needs? But it will help her to excel. It will help her to build something that's solid and good if she has the covering of her husband or father. Verse number 14 asks another question. Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it dishonors him? He's asking another question. Doesn't nature teach us that if a man has long hair, it dishonors him? What does that mean? Again, notice, he's talking about something that dishonors. If a man has long hair, does it dishonor the man? Now, again, he's talking about something that's very traditional. But then he says, does nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it dishonors him? How many of you realize that it's harder for men to have long hair than for women to have long hair? Now, does it dishonor a man? In that culture, yes, it did. It was dishonoring for a man in that culture to have long hair. Verse number 15, but if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her. What's he saying? He's saying that naturally women have longer hair. And what does that say? That long hair then glorifies that woman. That long hair brings respect and honor to that woman. For her hair is given to her for a covering, what's he doing? He's comparing the woman's long hair to the covering of her husband or father. And let me just say this. Maybe you've noticed that I've said husband or father several times this week when talking about the covering of a woman. I believe that every woman should have the covering of her father until marriage. And then the father moves that covering from the woman over to her husband. And that husband then becomes the covering of the woman. I hope that you understand that. Now, let's go on to verse number 16. But if one is inclined to be contentious, what's he talking about? If a person just always wants to argue and argue and argue and argue, what's he talking about? He's talking about not only women, but he's talking about men arguing this fact. He's talking about women wanting to argue this fact. You see, the Apostle Paul's writing to the city at Corinth. He's writing to the church in Corinth. And the church in Corinth was notorious for arguing. They would argue about everything. Everything. In fact, this verse number 16 is a verse that's going to connect the next teaching of 1 Corinthians 11, which is communion. What's he saying? If one is inclined to be contentious, in other words, if you want to argue about everything, if you want to just constantly stand there and argue, notice what he says, we have no other practice. What's he saying? You want to argue about it? I'm out of here. You know what I found in my many years of life, 72 years now and counting, if you want to end an argument, walk away. Just walk away. And that's what the Apostle Paul's saying. Hey, we have no practice. We're not going to do it. I'm not going to stand there and argue with you about whether a man should have long hair or not. I'm not going to stand here and argue about the length of a woman's hair. I'm not going to stand here and argue about man's authority over a woman and so forth and so on. If you want to be contentious, you want to argue about it, and by the way, again, that was very characteristic of the Corinthian church. That's why he wrote the 13th chapter, 1 Corinthians, the love chapter. That's why he's going to talk about communion next. He said, if you want to be contentious, we have no practice, no other practice. I'm not going to practice this, nor have the churches of God. What's he saying? He's saying in the church, we need to stop arguing. We need to stop being contentious. You know, it's amazing to me how many churches split over things that make no sense at all. Think about that as you go through your day. Thank you for watching. Join us again tomorrow.